Go on to the introduction of our next speaker, who is somebody I know will be very familiar to many of you, particularly if you read The Guardian. Matt D'Ancona has a weekly column in The Guardian. If you travel to London or you live in London, you'll also know that he writes regularly in the Evening Standard, a political commentator in the Evening Standard, and also for publications like GQ and others. But he's here today because he's published this very good book, Posttruth, about the whole phenomenon we're discussing in today's symposium. And I'll plug it, if I may, for Matthew, that there are editions on sale outside. And I think there's in the biography we've given of Matt D'Ancona, we haven't mentioned this, but it's important in this book, and it's important, I think, in the kind of framing of this, that he's also a trustee of the Science Museum. And so comes to this not just from the perspective of thinking about politics, but also thinking about the role of science and evidence and truth in our broader society. So, Matthew, very welcome to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much to the IPR and to Bath University, and most of all to you all for coming to this event. I think it's an absolutely brilliant event, and having been on the kind of rock and roll tour of promoting a book in the last few months, the thing that's really excited me has been what I can only call the kind of civic energy around this subject. It's a subject that makes people depressed, but actually, in hearing people respond to it, I've been made very optimistic about the future. Because I think that people are concerned about it, and I think post-truth and fake news have become portmanteau words for a whole nexus of issues that have come together and we are concerned about. And what's terrific is that people, and not just in this country, are starting to think very, very forcefully, but also with real, going back to first principles about what we should do and how much we should do. I suppose that the first thing I should do really is justify what I'm talking about at all, because so many people, when they're confronted with the buzzword, the jargon, the phenomenon of post-truth, respond not unreasonably, well, haven't human beings always lied? Hasn't there been lying since human beings could communicate? What about Watergate? What about Bill Clinton's impeachment? What about the Iraq dossiers? What about spin? And for those who go back a little bit further, what about Machiavelli advising the prince to be a great pretender and dissembler? And to all of that I say, absolutely, yes. Mendacity is as old as communication, and falsehood has always been a feature of the human condition. You know a politician is lying because you know the rest of the joke. But post-truth is something different from all that, and something, I think, which is new. And the novelty is to be found not in the lies, but in our response to them. It's, if you like, about us, not about them. Now, very opportunistically and shrewdly, the Oxford Dictionary selected, as I'm sure you've heard today, post-truth as their word of the year last year, which gave it a kind of added boost. But they defined it well as shorthand for, and I'm quoting, circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And I think that gets right to the heart of the matter. At the risk of repeating some of what you've heard today, but just to set my own argument in some sort of framework of recent events. The Brexit referendum. Aaron Banks, the frequently underestimated, I think, businessman who bankrolled the unofficial Leave.eu campaign, was absolutely right in his analysis of the referendum outcome. Banks said the Remain campaign featured fact, 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 fact. It just doesn't work. You've got to connect with people emotionally. Now, those pressing nobly, in my view, for Britain's continued EU membership had bombarded the public with statistics, Leaving, they said, would cost 950,000 UK jobs. The average wage would fall by £38 a week. Each family would pay an average of £350 a year more on basic goods. £6 million invested by EU countries in the UK would be at risk. The cost of living would be £4,300 per household, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it became easy to caricature, and frankly not to caricature, just to describe this torrent of indigestible data as no more than a series of arbitrary claims, and so it proved. In contrast, what the Brexiteers understood was the need for simplicity and emotional resonance. They wanted a narrative that would give visceral meaning to a constitutional decision that might otherwise appear very technical and abstract. Enter the figure of Dominic Cummings, who was campaign director for the official campaign Vote Leave, who argued when the campaign was having its earliest discussions that the case for leaving the EU had to be both clear and it had to cleave to the specific grievances of the public in 2016. Now, there was a lot of talk about having a message based upon the trade opportunities that Brexit would offer. So there was talk of a slogan like "Go Global," the kind of thing that you see on rather sad T-shirts at party conferences. And this might have been intellectually defensible, but it wouldn't have won a single vote. Cummings remembered some earlier research that he had done on Britain's potential membership of the euro, which had revealed the potential traction among voters of a pledge to take back control. And therein was born a slogan and, to some extent, a referendum result. So let's move across the Atlantic to the other horror. After considering a run at the presidency for decades, and he really had, Donald Trump, I think, intuited a similar shift in popular behaviour. Now, let us face it, Trump was never what you'd call a sympathetic candidate, nor indeed is he a sympathetic president. And the opinion polls, very interestingly, before the election, showed that the American people were perfectly aware of his character flaws, including his capacity to lie. But he communicated what I would call a brutal empathy to them, which was rooted not in statistics or in empiricism or in meticulously acquired information or policy, but in a kind of untamed talent for rage, a sort of impatience and an amazing ability to attribute blame to absolutely everybody. And this had a very important consequence, which is that the familiar assertion which we hear in every election that this candidate was plain speaking didn't mean, as it had in the past, this candidate is speaking the truth. In 2016, it meant this candidate is different and might just address my anxieties and hopes. It's a big change. So when, after the election, Kellyanne Conway, by then senior aide to the president, spoke famously of alternative facts, she really captured, I think, to be honest, accidentally, but perfectly, this new epistemology. In the post-truth era, what used to be called reality is absolutely fungible. It's negotiable. The point is not to determine the truth by a process of rational evaluation and assessment and conclusion. You just choose your own reality as if from a buffet. And this is a huge change in the way that we approach the reporting of politics, but not just that. It's a huge change in the way that we approach the world generally. And it's, I think, no coincidence at all that alongside the Trump Brexit phenomenon and other smaller phenomena in politics, we've seen a huge restoration of interest in conspiracy theories, in pseudoscience, and most horribly in Holocaust denial. This is all related. So, how has this come about? I think the social basis of post-truth is the collapse of trust in traditional institutions. I think all else flows from this single poisonous source. It's not a sufficient cause of post-truth, but it was necessary. We go back to the financial crisis of 2008. That took the global economy to the brink of meltdown, averted only by eye-wateringly large state bailouts for the very banks that were themselves responsible for the disastrous collapse in the first place. In Britain, this was then followed immediately by the humiliation of the political class in the 2009 parliamentary expenses scandal. In a series of articles, the Daily Telegraph exposed these sharp practices that had enabled MPs to supplement their official salary by charging the taxpayer for everything from moat clearing and a £1,600 duck house to a bath plug, a packet of biscuits, and pornographic films. Extraordinary. Meanwhile, scandals in show business, especially the monstrous sexual crimes of Jimmy Savile, caused problems at the BBC and other institutions with which he'd been associated. And in my own trade, print journalism, the hacking controversy was no less of, and indeed probably a larger disaster, forcing the closure of the News of the World, the resignation of its former editor, Andy Coulson, as Number 10's Director of Communications, and then Lord Leveson's sweeping inquiry of 2011 to 12 into the conduct of the press. And here we are in 2017, and the regulatory regime has still not been really settled. So I mention all that because I think we live in an age of institutional fragility. Why does that matter? Well, a society's institutions, for all their flaws, have an important role. They act as guardrails. They're the bodies that incarnate a society's values and its continuities. And to shine a bright light on their failures, their decadence, and now, in some cases, their outright collapse, is bound to be, as it has been, intrinsically unsettling. And that's not all, because what has happened is that post-truth has flourished in this context like a virus, as, if you'll allow me to mix metaphors, the firewalls and the antibodies have weakened. Because when the putative guarantors of honesty, the people we rely upon in this regard, falter, so does the idea in the primacy of truth itself. So that's part one. The second part is digital technology, which has become the all-important, primary, indispensable engine of this change that we're discussing today. Statement of the obvious, really. Now, in the early years of the online revolution, it was optimistically assumed by many, including myself, in a rather hippie-ish way. It was really my hippie period, the early broadband years, that the internet would inevitably smooth the path to sustainable cooperation, global understanding, and happy pluralism. I really believe that. And I will confess there is still a part of me that feels that and will not yield that dream entirely. I still believe the internet is a force for good. But my eyes have been opened a bit from that happy Jefferson Airplane dream to a kind of slightly more punk reality. Because in practice, this new technology has, of course, held a mirror up to human nature, and it has done at least as much to foster balkanization and a general retreat into echo chambers as it has to promote unity. Barack Obama has so often put it very well in his farewell address. He said, "We become so secure in our bubbles that we start accepting only information, whether it's true or not, that fits our opinions, instead of basing our opinions on the evidence that is out there." And I think that that's a very succinct definition of the problem. Because for all its wonders, and they are wonders, the web does tend to amplify the shrill and to disguise complexity. And those are two really big problems when you're talking about the free flow of information in liberal societies. For many, perhaps most, actually, it encourages confirmation bias rather than a quest for accurate disclosure. As the writer, originally a coder, in fact, Eric S. Raymond famously predicted in a book of the same title, the old cathedral, the hierarchy of information, has yielded place to the bazaar, the great noisy marketplace. And of course, as in all bazaars, there are profits to be made. most recently from the production line of clickbait hoaxes, unscientific medical claims, crackpot theories, fictional sightings of UFOs or Jesus, you name it. The disincentives to publication are still marginal, and the ease of production enticing. For those on social media, anonymity dramatically reduces accountability, as we all know, and the buzz of the hive sends the falsehood fizzing into cyberspace to do its work. Never, I think, has the old adage that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes seemed so timely. So, in this great cacophony, the flow of information is changing. It's increasingly dominated by peer-to-peer interaction rather than by the old-fashioned imprimatur of the traditional press or the broadcasting organisations. We consume what we like, what we agree with, and consciously or unconsciously, we shy away from the unfamiliar. The ultimate generator of novelty, the internet, has also become, paradoxically, the curator of hearsay and of folklore and of prejudice. And you may say, well, that's always been the case. People have always chosen newspapers they like. They've always tended to talk to people that are in their general, that share their worldview, and that's, of course, true. But what's happened is that, to use that slightly overused word, the digital technology has weaponized this tendency. And it's not a design flaw. This is an absolutely crucial point. This is not an accident. This is exactly what the algorithms, those secret algorithms, are meant to do. They are absolutely designed to connect us with the things that we like already or might come to like. It's a huge change in the flow of information to people. These algorithms are fantastically responsive, I think to a degree that's still not quite appreciated, to personal taste, to personal history, and they are so far fantastically blind to veracity. So the web has become, by a series of events, a series of happenstances, the definitive vector of post-truth, precisely because it doesn't care. It's indifferent to falsehood, to honesty, and to the difference between the two. And that, to go to a subset of post-truth, is why fake news has become such an issue. Now, just a word on fake news. I think the word fake news has become overused, and to the point where it really just means something I don't like. Trump, very in a technique that psychologists would call mirroring, sensing the danger of the fake news label, annexed it, like an old-fashioned dictator would annex a nearby sort of small domain. He took he took fake news to himself and redirected it at the media organizations he didn't like. But I think fake news is something very specific. I think fake news is media content that is knowingly distributed as false for commercial or political gain. That's my definition. Others will have broader definitions or narrow ones, but that's mine. And it certainly played a big part last year in the US election, especially on Facebook. Amongst the most read hoax stories of that year were the following: the claim that Obama had banned the Pledge of Allegiance in all schools, the headline, Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president, releases statement, a report that Trump was offering free one-way tickets to Africa and Mexico for those who want to leave America, and my personal favorite, ISIS leader calls for American Muslim voters to support Hillary Clinton, which is not necessarily something you'd want on your CV. And it is funny, but this is the kicker. As ludicrous as these stories undoubtedly are and seem, and in retrospect become more funny, they commanded belief. There was a poll in December last year by Ipsos, of more than 3,000 Americans. And it found that 75% of them, 75% who'd seen fake news headlines of this category, judged at least one or two of them to be accurate. So this is not a small marginal crank phenomenon. These headlines that make us laugh now were taken seriously by a great many voters. So if digital technology is the hardware, to continue the metaphor, post-truth has proven to be a mighty software. It reduces political discourse to a kind of video game in which you just play forever on multiple levels, and the sole point of the exercise is to keep going. And of course, that's why conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, Holocaust denial are back in business, because the point is simply to keep your point of view out there, getting clicks, getting traction on social media, proliferating. That is the goal of media circulators in the post-truth world. And it is changing the way that we consume information, whether we like it or not. Now, what can be done? Because in a way, everything I've said to you so far is kind of millenarian and depressing. And in fact, although I want to be realistic, I'm actually an optimist. The first thing we have to accept, we must accept, is that there is no pendulum in politics or in history. I detect, as I go around, particularly governmental organisations, a slight sense, somewhat skewed to older generations, that the pendulum is going to swing back. This internet thingy is going to, which people acknowledge is very useful. Emails are good after all. Smartphones quite useful. They've got their Fitbit things there. But it will grind to a halt. It will stop somewhere. There will be a plateau, and we'll calm down and learn how to deal with it, and everything will be fine. And they also believe, some people, that there will be a kind of rush back to the old liberal institutional order from a mob realizing penitently what a terrible mistake it's made. And this is delusion. Whatever follows Trump, however Brexit works out, whatever happens in France, whatever happens in Myanmar, whatever happens in China, we're not going back to the old dispensation. Whatever happens next will be post-Trump. It won't be anti-Trump, it'll be post-Trump. We have to get used to this new ecology and work out how to negotiate our way around it. So what do? Well, the first kind of package of things I think we need to do is what I call the scrutiny spectrum. And this is kind of the nuts and bolts, boring stuff in a way, which is just to kind of react in a common sense way to a new environment. Underreported, but extremely important, is the growth in the fact-checking industry. I think this is terrific. Fact-checking used to be called journalism. But for some reason, perhaps connected with the things I've been talking about, people are not so sure anymore. And the emergence of third-party fact-checkers, First Draft, Full Fact, and so on, and also those attached to organisations like the BBC's Reality Check and so on, have been enormously important. And for two reasons. First of all, they've given citizens the chance to check things more or less in real time. But more subtly, I think they've forced journalists to raise their game. I'm noticing now a much greater tendency amongst journalists to do what I would call footnoting, which is not to say that they actually put footnotes in their articles, but they say where the reporters come from. That terrible phrase, studies show that, is starting to disappear. And hyperlinks online go to the proper place, so you can judge for yourself whether the claim that's made in the report is actually justifiable. This is an unalloyed good. You know, it's a tremendous example of civic energy and fight back. And to be applauded, and I hope that all those organisations that are doing it get loads of money from the right sources. Second, there's litigation. There's been a number of cases around continental Europe, really, of people who've been fed up of being misrepresented on social media. There was a case of a Syrian refugee whose a snap was taken of him, I think when he met Angela Merkel. And the snap was cropped, so it was just him, and used quite arbitrarily in a number of stories involving terrorist attacks. This is a monstrous libel on this poor guy. And he, quite rightly, and I think with the help of a charitable organisation, took Facebook to court. And the important thing that has come out of that case is that the trial judge said the law is not up to this case, which is actually the most important verdict with respect to the litigant. In other words, the law has to come up to speed with entirely new pressures. I mean, the job of law is not just to create new powers, but to create powers that are apt for the times and apt for the pressure, the social pressures that are upon us. And that's absolutely right. So there is a role for litigation. Above all, and this is my big bugbear, I think that digital literacy should be a compulsory subject for primary school children upwards. And I don't just mean online safety, important as that is. I'm talking about teaching children how to use the web effectively, not just as a means of communicating with their friends, because they'll always do that, but as an information resource. How are they to know which websites are good or bad? Why would they know? Why would a 7-year-old know that the BBC news website or the Times or the Guardian or whatever or Reuters or any number of sites are more reliable than others? Why would they know that intrinsically? They have the biggest choice that any human beings have ever had of information resource. It's extraordinary that we aren't teaching them how to be adept and very discerning users of this incredible torrent of information. It became fashionable about 10 years ago, somewhat patronisingly, to talk about citizen journalists. There was always that little appeal at the bottom of news stories. You know, if you've seen a sheep or a cat like this, do send us a picture. I think people need to be citizen editors. They need to be helped towards understanding what is coming at them. And that may involve systems of kite marking, giving websites, the kind of ratings that you give food through food labelling. Again, not done by the state. The last thing we want is a ministry of truth, but done by reliable sources that you can trust. And I think that's something that will actually happen. I have a high level of confidence on that. Then we come to a subject that we could really talk about for more hours than is strictly good for our health, which is the whole question of the tech giants and their future. I mean, in sum, it's extraordinary to reflect that only 13 years ago Facebook didn't exist. Facebook is now so dominant. It has such a grip upon the information flow of the world. There is so much information on it that can be scraped off by people to use for marketing, for advertising, and perhaps for more nefarious purposes, that we clearly need to look at the way in which it is changing the behavior of the planet. And I choose those words advisedly. I mean, it is a vast force. Google has become the way in which the window, the little letterbox through which we look at everything that has ever happened. Why is it that the algorithms work as they do? I was playing around when I was writing the book, and I tapped in, is the Holocaust true? When I was writing about the Holocaust denial phenomenon. And 5 out of 10 of the responses that came up were rampaging right-wing Holocaust denial sites. Really heavy, nasty, David Irving Der Stürmer type propaganda. Now, what if a 10-year-old had done that? This is not acceptable. You cannot have as powerful an information source that is used by every single person pretty much who uses the internet as a search engine, at least in West, outside China, without some form of nod in the direction of veracity. It's very interesting what has happened so far. In the first flush of this debate, the tech giants were very, very cagey and said, we are not publishers, we are platforms. It's not our business what comes through our system. But there was a paradox in this, which was that they admitted that they had something called community standards. And I was, as you do, I was in Slovenia last week and on a panel with a representative of Facebook who said, "Oh, we're not publishers. We're a platform, but we've got community standards." And I said, "Well, if you're just a platform, why do you need community standards? Because if you're not responsible for the material, why do you need to have responsibility for the material?" And there was a little bit of shifting and glazed eye expressions and a kind of verbiage about accountability. But it's quite clear to me that Facebook and its parallel social media are indeed publishers and will have to have some sort of accountability. Now, the question really is, to cut a long story short, how will that be imposed? The worst possible thing will be a kind of Ministry of Truth solution. You know, a secretary, God forbid. I mean, think of the candidates for being Secretary of State for Truth. You know, imagine Boris as Secretary of State for Truth. It could happen. And I think it's worth, joking apart, I think it is worth bearing this in mind because governments are hovering over this because they know that it's shifting from a freedom story where people love the idea that they can do whatever they want on their social media to a this danger to our nation's youth story, and that there are easy votes to be harvested from the government says enough is enough. And there's nothing wrong with having a very good system of self-regulation. There may be quite a lot wrong with a system that involves too much state agency. So we need to be careful what we wish for in all this. Damien Collins, who is one of those MPs who really deserves such a good press because he spends a lot of time, he's chair of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and he spends a lot of time thinking about this, and he's doing a Select Committee report on this very subject. And I think it's going to be one of the most interesting first draft attempts to work through what the hell we do about all this. I don't think it'll be the finished article at all, but I think it will be a very, very interesting first attempt in the foothills of this long debate and well worth keeping an eye open for. So that's the tech giants. Self-regulation if possible, regulation, I suppose, if necessary, but I hope not. The next point was touched on in the last panel, and it's a very interesting one, which is the whole question, which is that, well, if facts aren't enough, what do we do? And this is a very good question, and one that requires a great deal of very sophisticated thought, because facts aren't enough. There's been some fascinating psychological work on what's called the backfire effect by a guy called, most recently by a guy called Brendan Nine, works at Dartmouth University. And he has shown that if you take someone who is let's say, a climate change denier, and you expose that person to an absolute welter of information proving that there has been man-made climate change, the likelihood is that that person will retreat even further into their conviction that there is no such thing as man-made climate change. The classic example of this was the absolutely outrageous birther controversy in America, where there are all these claims about Obama being born in Kenya, not America. At each stage that Obama released more information about his place of birth in Hawaii, from the long form birth certificate to the short form birth certificate to the long form, fewer people believed him. In other words, you actually got to the point where producing facts made people go, well, of course, they would say that. So this is a kind of a rather dramatized way of expressing a core truth, which is facts are not enough anymore. This is a huge problem. I mean, how do you get past it? There is no silver bullet answer to this, but there are some pathways you can identify. One of which is, I think that facts need now to be no longer communicated, as it were, as a bombardment of data, but in a way that recognizes emotional as well as rational imperatives. Now, let me give you a micro example of that, just to sort of set the ball rolling. Very interesting new methods of diagnosis being used in the medical community by some doctors, many of whom have been trained in addiction work, called motivation interviewing. It's time-consuming, so the NHS don't like it much, but it works, which is that instead of just looking at the patient and saying, you've got flu, you're dying, your leg is broken, you ask the patient about their feelings, their behavior, their anxieties, what's been happening, and so on. And you take them through a process which actually leads, it's been shown, to better diagnosis. So, in other words, you combine the factual knowledge of the medical professional with a process that is psychologically acute and empathetic. A very good example of the mixture of the two. Look at the politicians who've aligned factual claims with emotional significance. And you don't have, I mean, go back to someone like Harvey Milk or Martin Luther King or John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln. You know, this is not modern stuff. These are the great figures of political history. They have always brought the two together. This is nothing new, but it's a lost art. And part of the reason it's a lost art is because political debate has been so infantilized. I mean, can you imagine a cabinet minister now trying, or indeed a head of government, trying to begin a speech or have the payoff of a speech as, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. The demand, the call to maturity involved in that would never get past the blue pencil of the spin doctors. And I think this is a huge shame, because what you end up with is a yawning gulf between rhetoric and reality, between expectation and what actually happens. And nowhere is there a place where people meet with emotional honesty and factual accuracy. And the great task of the political class and the media class, and yes, of citizens, is to get back to that place. And I don't today have a one-stop shop answer to how you get to that place, but that is the place where you start to deal with the post-truth problem. There's a marketing expert called Jonas Sachs, who talks about the difference between inadequacy marketing, where you say, you know, you look terrible without that skin cream, and empowerment market, where you say, why don't you wear those trainers? Now, that's a very trivial way of putting the difference, but it actually makes a lot of sense to me, which is that if we're looking for a mature political debate, we have to treat people as adults. And that really brings me to my final point, which is that in the end, if you ask me about post-truth and how to fight back, my answer to you is that it has to be both a collaboration and an insurgency. And by insurgency, I don't mean taking to the streets, although there's nothing wrong with street rallies, but I mean the call to arms which asks individuals to accept that democracy is not a free ride and that truth in the end is discovered rather than distributed. Being passive is not a neutral position. It's a choice. And if you make that choice, don't be surprised if things go awry. My favorite quotation in the whole world is of Benjamin Franklin emerging from the second drafting. And he's approached in the street by a woman who says to him, "So, Dr. Franklin, what manner of government have you bequeathed to us?" And Franklin draws up to his full height, turns to the woman and says, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And the "if you can keep it" is the key. If you can keep it. If you can keep it, we'll be fine. Thank you very much.
Of course, yeah, delighted.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's an excellent presentation, really stimulating and really thought-provoking. We've got a little bit of time for some questions before we break for coffee. So if you'd like to say who you are and ask a question, I'll start up there with somebody I do know. It's Hugh Lauder at the top, and then we'll come down to some others. Yeah, Hugh.
Many thanks for that. I'm going to ask you a question to which you've kind of alluded to some of the possible answers. But the bold question is this. I'm a professor of education and political economy. We live in a world where people are better educated in the United States and in Britain in terms of qualifications than ever. How is it therefore possible that we've returned to the situation that you've described, where people are not prepared to, or many people are not prepared to take on the facts, as it were, of the matter, the evidence, which is what we do in the IPR, to adjust their thinking? It's a paradox.
It is a paradox, but it's a paradox which contains, I think, the seeds of optimism, which is people are better educated than they've ever been before. Therefore, as it were, the cognitive stock is great. However, it'd be very hard to have an educational system that keeps pace, or would particularly have kept pace, let's put it like that, with what's happened in the last 15 years. I think what we have to acknowledge is that we've reached a point of intellectual emergency where we have to acquire new skills. And what I do say about education is that, as a trustee for the Science Museum, I'm always going around the country banging on about STEM, and I stand by that a million times over. And please don't take what I'm about to say as in any way a diminishment of that. But I do think that there's been a loss of sight of the value of critical thinking, philosophy, the humanities, and the capacity to learn how to learn. Because this is what we're all going to have to do anyway, or at least our children certainly are, which is how to be incredibly nimble. The world is more volatile than it has been, certainly in living memory and perhaps ever. And that means that the people we've educated may have to accept that their education, even if in a kind of unofficial, amateurish way, is continuing. I was of a generation that got its undergraduate degree and then thought maybe about doing some postdoc or not, but that was it. You did your education, then off you went to do your career, and then you retired, and then you died. and that was how it was presented, with a copy of Pete Seeger's Little Boxes as a gift. Some will understand that reference, the older ones anyway. But I absolutely understand what you're saying, but I don't think that there's any reason to despair. What I do think, though, is that I would like to see more faculties of digital literacy, of more professorships that understand that the digital world is not just about the internet and what's under the bonnet, but about behaviour and what it means for the way we live. And I think that we all, kind of in a micro way, are going to have to adjust to that. But because we're well educated, we can do it.
Right. Hi. I'm Robin Aitken. I help organisations manage their finance, quite often entrepreneurial organisations. So I'm going to ask you a question about finance. So it's really, what is the price of truth? Because I think one of the problems with the internet is because there's this sort of free culture, that the money's not being invested in quality journalism, and there's issues with journalist organisations making enough money. So the question to you is, what is the price of truth? And also, do you know how do these fact-checking sites, how are they funded? And is that transparent?
It's a really good question. On the second one, my anecdotal belief is very well, but I couldn't I wouldn't sign an affidavit to the effect that they all were. But you're right, they should be, because if it turns out that they're all actually funded by Robert Mercer in America or Aaron Banks, then it would be a different matter. My God, the business model of journalism, again, is a whole other conversation, and one that, I was going to say I hear your pain, but I also feel it. It's a huge issue democratically, because what happened was we got it wrong. When the internet was basically dial-up and the dot-com crash had happened, there was a very strong view in what used to be called Fleet Street that the internet was going to be a bit like the tennis court outside a big house. It's going to be this nice thing that sort of people sometimes, I'll go to the internet and have a look. A bit like a card index, And then suddenly broadband came along and pow! We suddenly realized that we'd thrown all our content for free up online onto devices, and this is even before the smartphone, that people could just use immediately. So what was the value in buying print newspapers? Then the next argument was, people love newspapers. They love them. They absolutely love them. They'll never say no to, well, the evidence suggests otherwise. And the fact that I would guess that almost everyone in this room is carrying either a tablet or a smartphone, or if not, they've left it at home, suggests that that is the way the world is going. The irony is that probably what we should have done, which really is an irony, is charge for the digital and give the newspapers away as merchandising. But that's, spilt milk under the bridge, as they say in the city. So from now on, all I can say is I really, really hope that, for two things. One is that there isn't a crash in the world economy, because we really need that advertising. Boy, do we need it. That's a short-term thing. Long-term, strategically, that there are people of good heart who are able to understand that owning newspapers is a really great thing to do. The more pluralistic the ownership, the better. The Guardian is, as you know, owned by a trust. It works very well. But I don't knock Jeff Bezos for buying the Washington Post one bit, because that has kept a great newspaper alive, and it has done some fantastic work, particularly in the last 7 to 8 months. So I don't have if I did, I'd be off doing it. I don't have an answer on the business model thing, but you're right. The question is, what price truth? And my final thought in response to that question is, thank God for the BBC. I mean, talk about value for money. For however many quid a month it is, you get pretty reliable information for free online, on television, and I think you'll see it expanding around the world, because I think Tony Hall has some very exciting plans to turn BBC World into something much bigger and much more exciting. And when I go around the world talking to people about this stuff, it's amazing how often the BBC comes up as a source of, thank God that's something we can go to and rely upon. So to all those Tories out there, and I'm not suggesting they're in this room, but who say, the BBC's, I really hope they could just shut them up, because like the NHS, it's one of the two great institutions of the 20th century we should be bloody proud of, and long may it reign.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ali. I'm a student of IPR, DPRP program.
Hi, Ali.
Thank you. I have a bit of a problem in sort of agreeing with your overall results or presentation. The way I think I listened to your speech is that you have created a dichotomy between feeling and facts, and between emotion and evidence, and between irrationality and rationality. You have created this argument. And then truth and post-truth. And I was hoping that you would not extend this dichotomy into truth and lie, but you almost did it in my view. You quoted, you provided a quotation in which actually truth and lie were compared. I think the overall impression is that whatever has happened now is is not just post-truth, is actually irrational, is not based on facts, which in my view is, I think, is disrespect to those millions of people who have voted for Brexit, who have voted for Trump, for instance. And it's also, I think, this view is also disrespectful of democracy and free opinion itself, and on intelligence of those millions of people who actually voted for Brexit and for Trump. I think you also mentioned in the answering first question, you used the words intellectual emergency. I agree with that. I think that's not just that. It's an intellectual crisis now. It's a crisis because we are not able to explain the turbulent times. We are not able to explain how internet, how Facebook have really changed the way, have really changed the constructs and the opinions, and of course, public policy itself. And we have to come to terms with this change. And I hope that the intellectuals would come up to this challenge of putting a more coherent explanation of this big change, rather than a simplistic division between, emotion and facts. Thank you.
Well, okay, lots in there, lots of very interesting things. First of all, on emotion versus facts, I tried at the end, perhaps a little over-concisely, to bring the two back together again and to acknowledge that I think in this new ecology, we have to wrap facts in a way that has emotional resonance. So I do draw that dichotomy, but I think it's an old one, and people who are interested in preserving the truth are going to have to accept that emotional resonance matters. Secondly, on why Facebook and so on have brought about this change. Well, again, I did try and address that, but as I said, I think it's a huge subject and one I'd love to talk at greater length about, but it's at least an hour's talk in itself. So we can chat about it afterwards, but at the risk of not the risk of, actually, in order to plug my book, there's a lot in there. The final point, though, and I'm going to push back on this, is I'm not in the respect business. That's not what I do. I'm a hack. I've actually been hacked. That's my claim to fame, is that I was I had to go down to Putney Bridge to register the phone calls that had been hacked. I'm down in the gutter, me. And my job, if I have a job, with respect to the democratic process, is to tell it how I see it, not to operate some sort of cautious and respectful observance of people, and to operate some kind of phony moral equivalence. Look, if you ask me, I think the Brexiteers lied their teeth off, right? I think that bus was a bloody outrage. I think the Remain campaign was pathetic, but there's no doubt that Brexit was based on a pack of lies. And I wouldn't be fulfilling my mandate and the job that I do if I didn't say that. Trump, I get it how he won, but I'm not going to pretend that I think it was honourable. The fact that lots of people voted for him, fewer than Hillary, by the way, it doesn't mean I have to agree with them. I'm not a politician. I don't have to go out there and hedge my bets and say, please vote for me next time. I don't care. I really don't. And so the only point of being a journalist is the ability not to care about that sort of thing. My job is not to respect people's feelings. My job is to try and tell the truth. If people can't handle that, switch off.
To finish on that point, actually, such a good one. But there was a gentleman here, and then we got two more. So we'll just get three in. Actually, we'll take them all together, because we've only got a few minutes. So if you could be quick.
Thanks, Matthew. Craig Johnson. I'm at Cardiff University. To kind of pick up a little bit on the last question, I just want to ask about your thoughts on the effects and consequences of this on the political system. So Trump, an unpopular Republican, beats an unpopular Democrat after 8 years of Democrats in government. If we take a step back, that's not especially surprising. Government loses a referendum after 7 years of being in power, and it's moderately unpopular. Again, not especially surprising. I was wondering, are we maybe over-exaggerating the relationship between fake news and just stuff that we might disagree with?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in the sense that, you know, the one thing you can be absolutely sure about in politics is that there's no point in predicting anything, is there? Because last year everyone was running around being racist and unveiling posters saying to immigrants and foreigners, and you know, and then by the time of the election, we'd all turned into socialists, and we were chanting for Jeremy Corbyn, which had a sort of charm to it, but it was also slightly mystifying in the sense, you know, okay, hang on, 1 minute here, you're over here saying, you know, go home, and on the other hand, it's, hey, build bridges. So actually, that's a sort of comic description of a deeply unsettling process, which is, I think that what has changed is that, you know, you used to be able to say, Donald Trump will not be Republican nominee because of. And you used to be able to say, Jeremy Corbyn was just challenged for the leadership of his party by almost all of his MPs. And even though he won, he's quite unlikely to get 40% in the next snap election. But he did. So clearly something is happening, both in terms of tribalism, but also in terms of people's ability to shift opinion and shift focus. Someone said the other day, it might have been Tim Montgomery, that what we've lost is the steady as she goes election. There used to be two kinds of election, time for a change or let them finish the job. The let them finish the job election seems to have gone off on holiday. It's change, 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 change. So you have these people who were pro-Obama, pro-Bernie and pro-Trump. What did they all have in common? Change. Not even content change, just change. And I think that's something to do with helplessness, which is we live in a world of hectic change, globalization, automation, digital technology, climate change, fundamentalism, terrorism, population mobility. It's the one the right love. I always think it's bottom of the list, actually. I'm not persuaded by it. However, it has created huge cultural uncertainty, and so people who and economic uncertainty and inequalities, and people who hear change think, okay, make America great again, take back control. I'm Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, fair play. I mean, what a campaign. You know, that one will go down in the textbooks. So my answer is that it's changed the political process fundamentally. The question is, will there be some restoration of order, or will there be a new order? Will there be? I think that what you'll see actually is a change in the kind of cast list of political campaigns, because at the moment it's the strategist, it's the pollster, it's the policy guy with a beard, it's the sort of office wife, if it's a man, or office husband, if it's a woman, who kind of says, no, you'll be fine. I think that kind of lineup will change. I think that the people around politicians will have to be very, very different. And I'm not suggesting I have an answer to that. But I think that in order to respond to this change, there needs to be really radical surgery on political praxis, which is maybe the next big question. Perfect for the IPR.
I'm afraid we're out of time there, but that was a fantastic session, Matthew. Thank you very much indeed.